Someone assumes you did something wrong before hearing your side of the story, and you immediately feel your entire body preparing for battle. A friend betrays your trust, and what might have been one broken friendship suddenly feels like proof that nobody can be trusted. You see someone your age moving through life with the support of loving parents, family connections, financial assistance, a place to fall back on when things go wrong, and something painful begins to rise inside you. You may genuinely be happy for them, but another part of you is angry. And this can be confusing because you may have already left the toxic environment. You may have gone low contact or no contact. You may understand intellectually what happened to you. You may have spent years rebuilding your life. Yet, the outside world keeps finding buttons that seem to be connected to something much older. The mistake is assuming that these reactions are always about what is happening in front of you. Sometimes they are. Unfairness is unfairness. Betrayal is betrayal. False accusations are wrong. Exploitation should make you angry. Being treated disrespectfully should produce some kind of emotional response in a psychologically healthy person. The goal of healing is not to become so emotionally numb that nothing bothers you. But when you come from a toxic family system, the present event can sometimes arrive carrying the emotional weight of every similar event that came before it. The friend did not create the original wound. The stranger who prejudged you did not create the original wound, but they may have touched it. And when an old wound is touched through a new experience, you are no longer reacting only to one moment. Your nervous system, your memories, your beliefs about people, and your accumulated sense of injustice can all enter the room with you. Certain experiences in the outside world resembled the emotional architecture of the family system I came from. And the closer the resemblance, the stronger the reaction. That does not excuse every reaction, but it explains why learning to manage anger requires more than simply telling yourself to calm down. You have to understand what the anger believes is happening. Consider unfairness. Imagine working harder than someone else, contributing more, having greater experience, and watching the other person receive the opportunity, promotion, recognition, or reward. Almost anybody could become frustrated by that. But if you grew up as the scapegoat in a family where fairness was never actually the organizing principle, the situation may mean something more to you. Perhaps the golden child was praised for things you were ignored for doing. Perhaps your mistakes were documented while someone else's mistakes were excused. Perhaps expectations changed depending on who was being judged. Perhaps you learned that being good was not enough. Working hard was not enough. Telling the truth was not enough, because the conclusion had already been decided before the evidence was examined. Then you enter the workplace and see favoritism again. On the surface, you are angry about a promotion. Underneath it, something older may be saying, "Here we go again. It does not matter what I do. The game is already fixed." And this is where one present injustice can awaken years of accumulated frustration. Your anger is responding not only to the coworker who was favored, it is responding to every moment when effort failed to protect you from unfair treatment. The present event becomes evidence for an old conclusion. That is the hidden danger of a trigger. A trigger does not merely remind you of what happened. It can temporarily convince you that what happened is still happening everywhere. Once that happens, the emotional intensity rises because you are no longer solving one workplace problem. Psychologically, you are trying to solve the ancient problem of finally forcing an unfair system to admit that it was unfair. The same thing can happen when you feel that you are lagging behind in life. This is a particularly complicated form of anger because it can contain grief, envy, exhaustion, shame, and resentment all at the same time. You look around and see people whose families helped them with college. Their parents introduced them to somebody who helped them find employment. They were allowed to stay at home while saving money. Someone helped with the down payment. Someone gave them advice without secretly trying to sabotage them. When their relationship collapsed, they had somewhere safe to go. When they made a mistake, there was a family structure beneath them that prevented one bad month from becoming 3 bad years. Then you look at your own life. Maybe you had to survive the people who were supposed to help you survive. Maybe leaving your family meant leaving not only relationships, but infrastructure. This distinction matters. People sometimes talk about leaving a toxic family as though you simply stop answering telephone calls and suddenly become free. But family is also a social and economic structure. It can be emergency housing, childcare, transportation, money, professional introductions, advice, someone to call when the car breaks down, someone who knows somebody, someone who can lend you enough money to stop one temporary problem from becoming a crisis. When you come from a healthy enough family, much of this support can be so normal that you barely recognize it as an advantage. When you come from a toxic family, however, assistance may come with humiliation, manipulation, control, interrogation, or conditions. And when you go no contact, even that unreliable support may disappear completely. Now imagine watching another person move forward while carrying resources you never had. It is easy to call the emotion jealousy. But sometimes jealousy is only the surface. Underneath it is grief over the life you might have had if so much of your energy had not been spent surviving the people who were supposed to prepare you for life. You are not necessarily angry because somebody else has support. You may be angry because their support reveals the cost of your deprivation. Their safety reminds you of your instability. Their opportunities remind you of the doors nobody opened for you. Their family gatherings remind you of the place you cannot safely return to. Their ability to take risks reminds you that you had no safety net underneath your mistakes. The comparison hurts because you are comparing 2 outcomes without forgetting that the starting conditions were different. And there is something especially painful about realizing that you may have spent years blaming yourself for being behind, while ignoring how much energy it took simply to remain standing. This becomes even harder when rumination enters the picture. You may be driving, showering, working, lying in bed, or doing something completely unrelated when your mind suddenly retrieves something that happened 10 years ago. A sentence, an insult, a betrayal, a moment when you should have defended yourself differently, something you wish you had said, something you wish you had understood, and suddenly the event is emotionally alive again. Research on anger regulation has repeatedly found a relationship between rumination and prolonged or intensified anger. This makes intuitive sense. Every time the mind repeatedly reconstructs an injustice without reaching a different psychological conclusion, the body can be invited back into an argument that is technically already ended. But rumination often has a hidden purpose. You are not always replaying the past because you enjoy suffering. Sometimes the mind is trying to complete an unfinished experience. You replay the argument because you are searching for the perfect response. You review the betrayal because you are trying to locate the warning sign you missed. You remember the gaslighting because you want to prove to yourself that you were not imagining what happened. You reconstruct the family conflict because some part of you still wants a verdict. Who was wrong? Why did they do it? Why did nobody defend me? How could they treat me like that and continue living as though nothing happened? The mind keeps returning to the crime scene because it believes one more investigation might finally produce justice. But eventually, you have to recognize the limitation of this process. Understanding the past can free you. Rehearsing the past indefinitely can keep you psychologically employed by it. There is a difference. At some point, rumination stops being investigation and becomes re-exposure. You are no longer learning something new. You are simply reopening the file. And every reopening produces the same anger, because the mind keeps demanding an outcome that reality may never provide. An apology, an admission, a confession, recognition from the family, recognition from the people who watched what happened and chose convenience over courage. Sometimes anger continues because part of you is waiting for the past to change its mind about what it did to you. That is one of the most painful things to accept. Some wounds do not heal because justice arrived. They heal because you finally stopped making justice a prerequisite for your peace. That does not mean forgiveness. It does not mean reconciliation. It does not mean pretending the abuse did not matter. It means recognizing that remembering what happened and repeatedly reliving what happened are not the same form of awareness. Memory can inform your boundaries. Rumination can consume the energy those boundaries were supposed to protect. Lack of support can activate another layer of anger entirely. When you have to deal with an emergency alone, the immediate problem can become connected to a much larger emotional reality. Maybe you lose housing. Maybe your car breaks down and you have nobody dependable to call. Maybe you become sick. Maybe you lose your job. Maybe you are one emergency away from financial instability. For someone with a healthy support system, the crisis is the crisis. For someone estranged from a toxic family, the crisis can also become a reminder. Other people can go home. I cannot. That realization can produce enormous anger, because you are not only dealing with the emergency, you are grieving the absence of what family was supposed to mean. And in low-contact situations, the experience can sometimes be equally frustrating in a different way. Help may technically exist, but accessing it requires psychological payment. You have to tolerate comments, manipulation, guilt, interrogation, a lecture about your life, the rewriting of history, the possibility that your vulnerability will later be used against you. Perhaps the help is deliberately inadequate, so you remain desperate enough to come back. Perhaps they help you and then announce the help to everyone else as evidence of their generosity. Perhaps every emergency becomes an opportunity to remind you who supposedly has the power. So the assistance is not really support. It is access disguised as support. And this is an important psychological distinction. Healthy support reduces your burden. Controlling support transfers the burden from one area of your life into another. You may solve the financial emergency, but create an emotional one. You may obtain somewhere to sleep, but lose psychological safety. You may receive money while being reminded that your independence can be revoked. Eventually, you can become angry not only because you need help, but because needing help itself has become associated with danger. That can make you fiercely self-reliant, sometimes admirably so. But self-reliance can become another survival reflex when you begin experiencing every dependency as vulnerability. Then someone offers help, and you become suspicious. Someone gets close, and you prepare for the debt that will eventually be collected. Someone does something generous, and instead of relaxing, you wonder what they really want. This is how trauma can complicate anger. The anger is rarely standing alone. Sometimes anger is protecting grief. Sometimes it is protecting humiliation. Sometimes it is protecting fear. Sometimes it is protecting the person who learned that being vulnerable around the wrong people had consequences. And then there is prejudgment. Few experiences can activate the family scapegoat as quickly as being treated as guilty before anybody has examined the evidence. Someone hears a rumor. A manager assumes you caused a problem. A friend misunderstands a situation. A group makes a decision about your character without asking for your side. For another person, this may simply be an irritating misunderstanding. For the scapegoat, it can resemble the entire original family system. Because scapegoating is fundamentally a system in which the verdict often comes before the investigation. You were not examined and then found guilty. You were assigned the role, and the evidence was interpreted through the role. When you were quiet, you had an attitude. When you defended yourself, you were aggressive. When you withdrew, you were antisocial. When you succeeded, you thought you were better than everybody. When you struggled, your struggle proved what they had always said about you. The conclusion survived every contradiction, because the purpose of the story was never accuracy. The story had a function. It gave the family somewhere to place what it did not want to examine in itself. So, when someone in the outside world prejudges you, the anger may become explosive, because something inside you recognizes the old courtroom. No evidence, no curiosity, no presumption of innocence, just a conclusion. And suddenly, you are not merely defending yourself against one accusation. You are defending your entire identity against being placed back into a role you fought to escape. This is why awareness matters. Because the moment you recognize that an old pattern has been activated, you gain a possibility you did not have before. You can separate the present opponent from the historical one. This person may be wrong, but this person is not everyone who has ever been wrong about you. This situation may be unfair, but this situation is not your entire childhood happening again. This betrayal may require the end of a friendship, but it does not automatically prove that every human relationship is unsafe. That separation is one of the foundations of emotional composure. Not denial, separation. What belongs to this moment, and what belongs to another one? Betrayal provides one of the clearest examples. Suppose a friend spreads a false rumor about you behind your back. You find out. You become furious. The anger itself is reasonable. Trust was violated. But perhaps your family history included triangulation, secret conversations, character assassination, people discussing you instead of speaking to you, and alliances formed around stories you were never allowed to answer. Now the friend's betrayal is connected to an entire network of old experiences. The present says, "This friend betrayed me." The wound says, "People always gather behind my back and destroy me." Those are not the same statement. The first statement can help you establish a boundary. The second can reorganize your entire worldview around threat. This is why unmanaged anger can become expensive. Not because anger is inherently wrong, but because an old wound can convince you to make permanent decisions about the entire world based on temporary encounters with individual people. You begin anticipating betrayal before intimacy develops. You treat disagreement as disloyalty. You experience correction as humiliation. You interpret somebody else's success as evidence of your failure. You enter every unfair situation carrying every previous injustice. And now, the toxic family is no longer physically controlling your life, but the emotional reflexes created inside that system are influencing how you respond to people who never met them. That is the painful realization. Leaving the family can remove you from the environment. It does not automatically remove the environment from your reactions. This is where anger management needs to be understood differently. For the family scapegoat, managing anger should not mean becoming easier to mistreat. It should not mean suppressing legitimate outrage. It should not mean performing calmness while people violate your boundaries. And it certainly does not mean allowing people to do whatever they want because you are afraid of looking angry. Sometimes anger is information. It tells you that something feels unjust, something crossed a line, something important is being threatened. The skill is learning how to receive the information without surrendering control of the response. You can think of anger as an alarm. An alarm is useful because it alerts you to something. But you would not hand control of the entire building to the alarm. Instead of asking, "How do I stop being angry?" you begin asking, "What is this anger trying to protect? And what response actually protects it?" That second question changes everything. Because screaming at a manager may express your anger about favoritism. Documenting your work, asking for objective performance criteria, protecting your professional reputation, or finding a healthier workplace may protect you more effectively. Exploding at somebody who prejudged you may express the pain of being falsely accused. Calmly demanding evidence, correcting the record, and refusing to participate in a dishonest process may protect you more effectively. Sending 20 messages to a friend who betrayed you may communicate how deeply you were hurt. Ending access, preserving evidence where necessary, correcting false information, and walking away may protect you more effectively. The strongest reaction is not always the loudest one. Sometimes, composure is what allows anger to become precise, and precision is far more difficult to manipulate. This is one reason learning emotional regulation after a toxic family can eventually become an unusual strength. You have already experienced situations capable of provoking enormous emotional intensity. You know what it feels like to be misunderstood, excluded, provoked, betrayed, manipulated, left without support, treated unfairly. The question is whether those experiences will permanently make you reactive or eventually make you exceptionally difficult to destabilize. Imagine reaching a point where somebody can provoke you and you do not immediately give them access to your nervous system. You notice the heat. You notice the impulse. You notice the story your mind begins constructing. But you create a small space between the feeling and the action. Inside that space, you ask what is actually happening. Is this person truly threatening me, or are they reminding me of someone who did? Is this situation unfair, or is my history increasing the intensity of an already legitimate frustration? What boundary is necessary? What evidence do I need? What consequence am I willing to enforce? What action will I still respect tomorrow? This is not weakness. It is advanced self-protection. Because one of the easiest people to control is someone whose reactions can be reliably provoked. If I know exactly what to say to make you lose control, then, in a certain sense, I can control the next thing you do. I provide the trigger. You provide the reaction. And afterward, you are the one dealing with the consequences. This dynamic is especially familiar in toxic family systems. Someone provokes you repeatedly. You eventually react. Then your reaction becomes the entire story. Nobody discusses what happened before the explosion. Nobody discusses the pattern. Nobody discusses the manipulation. They point to the moment you lost control and say, "See, this is who you are." That experience can continue outside the family if you do not recognize it. There will always be people who benefit when you become emotionally disorganized. In workplaces, relationships, friendships, conflicts. Sometimes the person who remains composed controls how the event is understood afterward. This is why composure is not simply an emotional skill. It can be strategic intelligence. Your anger can be real while your behavior remains chosen. Your boundary can be firm while your voice remains controlled. Your consequence can be severe without becoming chaotic. You can leave. You can report. You can document. You can refuse. You can end the relationship. You can defend yourself. You can take legal or professional action when appropriate. You can do all of these things without handing the other person a version of you that they can easily use against you. That is the transformation. You stop confusing emotional intensity with effective action. And perhaps one of the most important parts of this process is learning to recognize your personal trigger families. Not simply individual triggers, but the deeper categories underneath them. Maybe favoritism activates the wound of unfairness. Prejudgment activates the wound of scapegoating. Rumors activate the wound of triangulation. A friend's betrayal activates the wound of broken trust. Financial emergencies activate the wound of abandonment. Seeing supported people succeed activates grief over what you did not receive. Once you identify the category, you can begin recognizing the emotional pattern before it takes complete control. Naming the deeper pattern creates distance. You stop being completely inside the emotion and begin observing it. And from that position, something else becomes possible. Choice. Sometimes the correct choice will still involve confrontation. Healing does not require passivity. There are situations where anger should move you toward action. But now, the action comes from clarity rather than emotional flooding. You are no longer trying to punish the person in front of you for everything that happened behind you. You are responding proportionately to the reality of the present. That word matters. Proportionately. Because when you have survived chronic unfairness, a proportional response can initially feel insufficient. You want the present person to understand the full magnitude of what their behavior represents to you. But they cannot. They were not there for the rest of it. And asking one present conflict to carry your entire history almost guarantees that the reaction will become larger than the situation can contain. Healing means allowing each person to be responsible for what they actually did. No more, no less. That protects you from minimizing mistreatment. But it also protects you from turning every new conflict into a trial for old defendants who are no longer in the room. Over time, this kind of awareness can change your relationship with anger completely. You begin noticing that anger has a rise and a fall. You do not have to obey it at its highest point. You can pause without surrendering. You can delay a conversation without avoiding it. You can write the message and wait before sending it. You can leave the room and return with a clearer objective. You can ask yourself what outcome you actually want instead of allowing the emotion to choose the outcome for you. Research on anger and emotion regulation supports the usefulness of approaches such as cognitive reappraisal, where a person deliberately examines and reframes their interpretation of an emotional event, while research has also linked persistent rumination with greater anger. But in lived experience, the principle can be stated more simply. Your first interpretation does not always deserve your first reaction. Sometimes you need time to determine what actually happened. Sometimes you need information. Sometimes you need to distinguish disrespect from misunderstanding. Sometimes you need to recognize that the person really did cross a line. And then you can respond. Not because you are no longer angry, because your anger now works for you. This is also where envy can be transformed. When you see somebody benefiting from a healthy family, you do not have to shame yourself for feeling something painful. You can acknowledge what their life is showing you. Maybe you needed support and did not receive it. Maybe you deserved encouragement. Maybe you should have been protected. Maybe your life genuinely would have been easier under different circumstances. You can grieve that without making another person's happiness your enemy. Their advantage is not your accusation. Their healthy family is evidence of what human beings are capable of giving one another. And perhaps that recognition can eventually help you build intentionally what other people inherited automatically. A support network, financial stability, trusted friendships, professional connections, community, emergency plans, people who can call you, people you can call. You may have to construct piece by piece what another person was born inside. That is unfair. but construction is still possible. And each structure you build reduces the emotional power of what was withheld from you. The same principle applies to trust. You do not heal betrayal by trusting everybody. You heal by becoming better at deciding who receives access. You do not heal unfairness by pretending the world is fair. You heal by becoming better at recognizing where your effort is respected and where it is being exploited. You do not heal abandonment by convincing yourself that you need nobody. You heal by learning the difference between dependency, interdependence, and control. You do not heal prejudgment by endlessly proving yourself. You heal by learning whose opinion requires a response and whose judgment deserves no jurisdiction over your identity. This is what emotional regulation eventually becomes. Not the elimination of emotion, the refinement of power. Your family may have taught you anger through chaos. Healing teaches you anger through precision. Your family may have taught you that conflict means losing control. Healing teaches you that conflict can reveal your control. Your family may have taught you that the loudest person has the most power. Life eventually shows you that the person who can remain connected to reality while everyone else is emotionally escalating often has an entirely different kind of strength. And this is why I no longer believe the final goal is simply to get rid of anger issues. The deeper goal is to understand the history inside the anger so completely that the history no longer gets to choose your response. You will still become angry. You should. There are things in this world worth becoming angry about. There will be unfair people. There will be betrayal. There will be favoritism. There will be people who judge you without evidence. There will be moments when you see what other people received from their families and feel the grief of what you lost. There will be emergencies when the absence of family support becomes painfully obvious. Healing does not create a life where none of this affects you. It creates a version of you who can feel all of it without being unconsciously transported back into the family system every time something resembles the past. You recognize the trigger. You understand the wound. You examine the present. You choose the boundary. You enforce the consequence. And then you continue with your life. The greatest victory is not becoming impossible to anger. It is becoming increasingly difficult to control through your anger. Because once you understand what your reactions are protecting, you no longer have to let those reactions run ahead of you. The anger can remain. The boundary can remain. The memory can remain. But the chaos does not have to remain with them. That is what composure eventually becomes for someone who survived a toxic family. Not pretending that nothing hurts. Not becoming endlessly forgiving. Not becoming passive. It is the ability to stand inside an emotionally charged moment and recognize that this situation may resemble your past without being allowed to become your past. You are no longer the powerless person trapped inside the original system. You have choices now. And the deepest form of anger management is learning to remember that before you react.